I have a couple of questions, two questions that I would like to challenge you, all four of you, on. And after that, I will open up for all of you to ask questions. So I have two questions for you. The first one is, it goes back a little bit to what Øystein Tunche said in his presentation, actually the last sentence he had on his slide. He foresee that other countries will be compelled to choose side between China and the United States. Yesterday, we heard the Norwegian foreign minister strongly emphasizing the need to protect our interests, but at the same time cooperate with China. And also, we heard this morning that the Norwegian Chief of Defense, Chief of the Armed Forces, the Admiral stating that dialogue with China is still important. But will we be able to keep this? Will we be able, if the United States asks European countries, either you're with us or against us, facing China, how do we handle that on the European side without risking the transatlantic relationship? So that is the first question I would like to challenge you. So perhaps if you would like to respond in the same order as you made your interventions, and then Øystein at the last to reply. Yeah, please.
The relation to China has been complicated, and it's a kind of dualism. We shouldn't be naive. I observed that Professor Tunche said that China wouldn't expand their and spread their values and their way to go their country, like the communism. I'm not sure about that. We see China operate in so many dimensions, from the big macro to the micro perspective. Let me take an example. For 2 weeks ago, a Chinese ski team was in Morocco. And during that training period, one of the ski instructors entered the local library and talked to the women working in this library, please remove some of this book about China. One of that book consider the Falun Gong movement. What's the rationale and what's the motivation for China to behave in that manner? Could this be a consequence of the new national intelligence law in China, where every citizen in China are obliged to protect Chinese interests inside China and abroad? I think we have to release that China's interest is to protect their citizens in China and outside China, their commercial interests, their investments, and their trade routes. We had to remember that 5.5 million Chinese people work abroad in Chinese companies, and 60 million Chinese tourists are traveling around the world. The Chinese authorities have to protect these people. Many of these 5.5 million people work in country where the safety is so and so, and there could be a risk of a political takeover, and they have to evacuate these people. So China is everywhere with different vehicles, and we should have a dialogue with China, but we should also stand up for our own interest and strengthen our connection with our key allies, which United States and some of the main countries in NATO. I have been in China together with the Standing Committee of Foreign and Defense, and my conclusion, my personal conclusion after this visit was that the Chinese authorities are soft in their form, but they are very, very strategic focused.
Thank you. Christian Tybring-Gjedde.
Yeah, You may call me naive, and that's fine.
Not you. All of us.
But first of all, I believe in trade, and I believe that that both the United States and China has a big advantage in having trade relationships. And also, we're talking about the EU as being our Norwegian biggest market. I would like to challenge that a little bit with the UK, US, and China. In the future, that may not be the biggest market, but that's besides the point. But I think right now, if the trade between US and China stopped tomorrow, I think both nations would lose a lot of standard of living, go down and decrease. So I don't think, and you can tell that on the surface, Horek, and of course you have challenges on other issues, on technology issues and so on, and cyber technology and so on. But I don't think anyone is actually better off winning this bipolar war. I don't think so. It's because we were fighting an ideological war during the Cold War, and we won it, thank God. But now I think it's different, and I don't think that the other question was about their neighbors. If the neighbors have to choose sides for what? I mean, choose sides of being indoctrinated into a Chinese system with no liberal values, no human rights, and is that what you're saying, that they have to choose between that or a free world with the United States? And I don't think that's not going to be like that, because then you're talking about geography. You're talking about influence in geographical terms. I think it's going to be influence in all other terms than geography. And that is also what Tunche was saying. I think it's the other way of influencing the world. So I'm a little more optimistic. I hope that China is a little smarter than the Soviet Union. I think that actually you can work together, even though they are behaving aggressively in the north. I know that, and in the 5G and so on. But anyway, I hope that they also would like to have greater standard of living, like the United States, like Norway. And if we all lose, it's not a good solution. So I hope that that we all can win.
Yeah, I actually do agree with Christian on this, his main message now, because it's clear to me that the number one concern of the Chinese leadership is the continuity of China and continuity of the party leadership in China, and the sort of continued relations that provide for development in China. And that at times, seen from China, requires making clear where you stand on several international issues in the neighborhood, and that might be uncomfortable for people around. But it's not expansionist in the classical sense. It's basically continuing to thrive in this colossal, enormous economic growth that they have been through, and make sure that they have the trade routes, they have the access to resources, and so on that they need. That might often lead them into conflict with others, but we have to understand what is the leitmotif in China. That's good news, because on some of these issues it will be possible to find agreement and alignment. They are not necessarily always in conflict. China is still, in principle, a defender of a multilateral order. Nominally, they speak much more highly about the multilateral order than the current incumbent in the White House. And they actually also, in many cases, do fund and act accordingly. Not every time that happens to great powers or superpowers, but rather often. And if you've seen from Brussels, there are an increasing number of cases, not on human rights and democracy and rule of law, but number of other international issues where the dialogue is going quite well, simply because the two sides agree. It's not like a compromise. They actually enter with the same starting point, and they find other conflicts. So I think the answer to your question is that we should try our best to avoid being forced to make a decision, and we have to do it with friends. And those friends are two places. Those are our European closest neighbors. We should be as close as possible to the EU. If it was up to me, we were closer than today, but I think that's still a majority view for a few years. But we should also work with other Asians. And I had the pleasure of signing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia, which meant, when I was foreign minister, that means that I gave up the right to invade Southeast Asian countries, so all the plans we had had to be scrapped. But the upside of that also meant that we are now in a much closer dialogue with ASEAN, and ASEAN is a bunch of countries that are dealing with exactly the same problem and also trying to avoid being forced. So go to Indonesia, go to Singapore, go to countries in that neighborhood and talk to them about how do you actually deal with the fact that you can't avoid the rise of China. It matters to you and is good for you, but you still want a good connection to the US. Let's do it together rather than each on our own.
Øystein, if I could put you on hold a little bit because Høyre Kelvenes asked for a small comment.
Yeah. The future for the Communist Party in China depends on the party's ability to lift more of the people up to the middle class. And here is the trade, the main vehicles to obtain that. But you mentioned the multilateral system. That's a very, very interesting question. How is the future for this system in a bipolar world order? We see that the United States took a more layback position in this system and in international institutions. At the same time, Chinese argue and are in favor for this system. But be aware, they are in favor of this system if this system can serve their own interest. They are establishing parallel arena and institutions, and they try to solve disputes with neighborhood country bilateral. Yes. The committee was in Indonesia 2 weeks ago, and the Indonesian authorities was very, very clear on that they shouldn't go in a bilateral discussion with China with this dispute. Exactly. The solution we have to find the solution in the international system and the international rule. What about the international framework, the international rule-based law of order in this bilateral system? That's a very interesting question. I am not optimistic. I am a little bit pessimist.
Øystein, what are your thoughts? You said yourself that countries will be most likely compelled to choose side. And will Norway face that challenge, and how do we deal with it?
I think Norway has already chosen sides. So it's clear to Norway that our fundamental interest is to be on the US side. But this doesn't prevent Norway from trading with other countries or developing dialogues with other countries or wherever. So it's just we're not going back to the Cold War. Even though we're discussing bipolarity, it's not going to be the East-West divide and the Iron Curtain. And this is the 21st century. It is globalization. But I do think that as we enter this new bipolar system, there are structural factors that maybe will reverse some of the globalization that we've seen the past 30 years. It will be more difficult to cooperate on a number of issues. I think we are actually experiencing that today. Think about it in 10, 20 years. If China doesn't collapse, it will gradually become even more stronger, more assertive, more aggressive. The US will become more desperate, more demanding from its allies. So that kind of environment, to me, says that it will be much more difficult to hedge. All these countries are hedging their bets, and they want a good relationship with China. All of the East Asian countries have China as its most important trading partner, but then they have strong security collaboration with the United States. They are balancing this now, hedging, but it's going to be more challenging in the future. That's what I'm arguing. But it's not going to be a similar system to the previous Cold War. I just wanted to clarify also on polarity, because easy to think of that the reason why it's no longer a unipolar system is that it's clear that the relative power shift have happened. The United States is not as powerful as it was 10, 20 or 30 years ago relative to other states. The question, are we moving into a bipolar or a multipolar system? If we have been moving into a multipolar system with great powers, then the states in East Asia and Asia could have balanced China. Russia, India, Japan, they could have balanced. And the United States would have done what the United States do in a multipolar system. It pulls back. It doesn't care about great power politics in Europe or in East Asia. because the regional powers can balance between themselves. That's why the United States did not enter the First World War in 1914. That's why they didn't enter the Second World War in 1939, because they had a grand strategy of keeping their flanks divided by having all these great powers in a multipolar system balancing each other. And then after the Second World War, the United States wanted to pull back, but it could no longer. There were no powers in Europe powerful enough to contain and balance the Soviet Union, so the United States took upon itself this role, and had that role for 40 years, and then everything changes with the unipolar system. The United States becomes a very different actor. And now they are shifting again. Now they have to take upon themselves a new role in this new bipolar system. If it wasn't a bipolar system, the United States could have left regional powers to balance China.
Espen Barth Eide has asked for a comment, and after that, I think we will open up for questions from the audience. Please.
Building about what Elvenes and Tunsjø now said, it's an interesting discussion which has been going on for many years, is what order is best for the, what systemic order is best for multilateral cooperation. And so the two answers is that, you know, it's very problematic if we have two competing powers, because they will try to break out of what the containment of the multilateral order. But we also have the experience of the neocon years in the US, or the short omnipotence of the US, where the whole argument around the second Bush presidency, early phase, was America is alone on the scene. Why do we have to listen to all these foreigners? And then, 10, 15 years later, the argument was, hey, Russia, you're violating international law. And Russia said, well, what did you do back, with Kosovo and so on? But the thing is that your view on whether you should constrain others, and hence yourself, depends on where you stand in the system. So the jury's out whether this kind of system would weaken or actually even strengthen certain sort of fundamental rules in the system.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, please. And briefly introduce yourself.
Turkish ambassador to Norway. Maybe this is slightly off the topic, but I would like to bring the discussion to another subject that might be very relevant. Now we are talking about North Atlantic security and NATO-related issues, but since we are talking about China, there is one fact that China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And whatever we are talking about China in the other aspects, we have to take into account this simple and important fact. And now that we have politicians in the panel and that Norway is preparing for a good exposure into the Security Council issues directly, it might be very relevant, very interesting to see how Norway and other Security Council members, if Norway is elected, of course, can engage China in all these subjects that we are talking about, global issues, new Cold War, and etc. We know that China has been acting more responsibly, less controversial than Russia in using veto power and in acting against the P3 in the Security Council context. But I don't know how it will evolve, and it might be very interesting to comment if you can. And this may enrich our discussion, I thought. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of you that would like to respond to that? Yes, to bring it up.
Thank you. Just to say that I'm not a very big supporter in Norwegian candidacy to the Security Council. That's not a surprise. I don't think it's very smart of Norway to be either on the side of Russia, or side of the China, or side of the United States. They're going to be very difficult issues that we have to take side. And I don't think it's very smart for a small nation like Norway to be that. I know it's very popular. There's going to be a lot of people working on these issues, and they feel very good to do all the speeches and have probably 20 more people working in the UN and all that. I understand that, and it makes a lot of sense. But again, if Norway is going to play that role that you're proposing, Ambassador, or it means that you remember the Nobel Peace Prize. and China remembers it still. Meaning that if we are trying to play a bigger role than we actually are, I think it's very unwise of us, and I hope that we will not try to solve the world problems. We are too small for that, and I think we should take advantage of the world order and the international system, not try to learn how to live our lives.
Barth Eide?
Well, very interesting question. First, I think the right way to answer it is when Norway wins the elections. I happen to be a strong supporter of the government's policy, in contrast to some of the government's parliamentary base. I give it massive, as much support as I can. And I think that, you know, I have frequently visited the council in my previous role as envoy. I've seen the dynamics up very close. China generally tries to seek for broad solution, be part of a broad settlements. China system abstains as much as it can from using veto. It's the Russians and the Americans that use veto. The others normally don't. And China is in principle against it. They're not going to give it up on their own, but they have this theoretical principle position that veto shouldn't be used, but in extreme cases and so on. So I think there's a lot to talk to China about, and I think you should go into that with an open mind, saying here's what we want to achieve. To which extent can we bring China on board if there's an issue Norway cares particularly about? Where can we agree with them? And then stand our ground when we can't agree. And I'm sure there will be issues where we'll disagree fundamentally, and where we will be divided on a more kind of east-west type of division, and others where we will find creative partnerships outside of the tradition. And I think that skilled Norwegian diplomats will be able to manage that quite well, and I'm not worried. I'm not so worried. I mean, it is true that you are more exposed when you're in the council, because, of course, the people who were there when the Iraq vote happened and so on, they will also remember it, whatever they voted. They do remember that for the rest of their lives. So there are these situations. But I strongly believe that you should take your turn at the wheel, and it's Norway's time to play that role and to stand our ground.
Briefly from Elvenes, and then we have 2 more questions.
Perhaps not a surprise, but I am on the opposite side of my colleague Tybring-Gjedde. Høyre is in favor that Norway are seeking a seat in the United Nations Secret Council because Norway is a small state. Our freedom depend on international law, international rule-based order. And this rule-based order is the first-line protection for Norway. Disappear this, it could be a chaos. And we see in the South China Sea that the Chinese doesn't respect the law of the sea. And what will be the consequence in the Barents Sea, in the Arctic, if this Chinese attitude will be implemented there? So in this situation with bipolar world order, I think it's very, very important to strengthen United States, not United States, United States too perhaps, but United Nations, which had a key role in the world rule-based order.
Thank you. The organizer has asked for the word, so please, Kate.
Okay, thank you. Just a question for the panel. I think it seems to forget that China is an authoritarian state. Talking about that China likes the multilateral order and that we can cooperate with China in all the bodies of the UN and other multilateral orders, institutions, we seem to forget that China is very eager of going into these institutions, and they are redefining the value and also, to a certain extent, how you are cooperating in small committees, in the UN and in other institutions. How are we going to, how is our resilience, both when it comes to our own states, but also in the multilateral system that we created after the Second World War, because they are going into this system.
We will take 1 more question before we open up for a response from the panel. Please.
Thank you. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad, and I'm very happy to hear that Christian Tybring-Gjedde does not support, or is not a great supporter of Norwegian membership in the UN Security Council, which is a view that I share. I'm also I also share his view that we have to stay friendly with China. It's a beautiful thought, but sometimes friendship comes with a caveat, cost. And the cost, as we all know, is actually expressed in a document which most of you know, issued on the 16th of December 2016. It's a document with a rather dubious form or dubious status and also dubious content. With regard to the status, it's not a treaty, which means that there was no need for ratification, and it has never been ratified, of course, which also means that it's non-binding. And with regard to the content, I think it's well known that it's rather, it's rather it's rather, it's fraught with some conflictual dimensions. Anyway, my question to the panel would be, what do the Norwegian parliamentarians think about any ideas or any means to limit the damage done to the, let's say, credibility and reputation of the Norwegian government with regard to that document? Thank you.
So we are moving into more norms and values in the questions. Tybring-Gjedde?
Thank you for the questions. They're a little bit related, actually, the challenges from China. And the document you're talking about, it's actually, let's say, it's very one-way, one-sided. There's an article there that says that Norway respects all kind of China interests. There's no article the other way around. And I have it in front of me here. It says the Norwegian government reiterates its commitment to the One China policy, fully respects China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, attaches high importance to China's core interests and major concerns, will not support actions that undermine them, and will do its best to avoid any future damage to our bilateral relations. And there's no other way around. That says that about Norway and China's relations. And this is Børge Brende, I think it's entered this agreement. And I think it's the terms here, the way they're using the words here, it's not very unfortunate for the relationship, and it seemed to me a little unnecessary to have such a document unless it's balanced. And I agree. I agree that China is a challenge, and that's not saying that China. I'm not that naive that I don't understand that China is trying to influence the world and trying to, as I think also, if you go a little bit back. Not saying, I'm not comparing these, but that's just a natural interest of bigger nations to actually try to influence the world and trying to have the best terms of both competition and, of course, also ownership of different institutions and also geographical areas. And we have to be aware of that, and then we have to be very careful what kind of territory we are actually letting them into. And I think 5G is a good example of that. We need to look up on our integrity. But I was saying that we can have advantage. All of us can have an advantage. Free trade is actually the best thing we can do. I'm not saying this is necessarily free trade, but I think trade is a good thing. And if you look at this, the wealth of Norway is also based on free trade and a trade through history. And I hope that China basically is interesting to have a higher standard of living and actually developing its country in all ways of infrastructure and so on. And hopefully, I don't think Chinese are evil people. I think they actually will try to have a better country for themselves and their citizens. I don't like the totalitarian regime. I don't like their anti-democracy. I don't like all the ways they're running their own country. But it's also one other thing that about China that we should be careful about, or we should be aware of. They have very homogeneous society, meaning that there are very less immigration, and the countries of United States and Europe is changing fast. And that is also another issue that we have to think about. We're looking at Norway and other nations in Europe like they've been since World War II. No, they're actually changing pretty fast. And also the United States are changing pretty fast, meaning this is changing the population. That will have a consequence. I don't know what kind of consequence, but it will have a consequence for the relationships.
Any of the other members of the panel that would like to respond to it? Øystein? Yes.
So, since I'm not politicians, I'm not going to answer the UN Security Council. I can sort of drop out of that. But I just want to follow up on what Christian Tybring-Gjedde is saying here. Listening to what you say, being critical about this document, You say you want to trade with China, but this was necessary to trade with China. I mean, it's just, I actually read it with more ambiguity, and I think basically what Norway signed up to here is what any country who has diplomatic relations with China would sign up to. You have to agree to the One China principle. You have to respect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And then you have the phrase about China's core interest, and you can say, like, it's up for interpretation. You can say that's core interest is about Tibet and Xinjiang, but it's not about the South China Sea. That's contested. So I think, but the more fundamental thing is that you are promoting, and I agree, we should cooperate with China, and we should try to maintain cooperation with China, but it's becoming difficult. And this particular agreement just illustrates how difficult it is to have a cooperation with an authoritarian state. And I think we are underestimating the direction that we are heading on ideology, on norms and values. Because China used to have a non-interference policy. It's no longer abiding by non-interference. Clearly, China is interfering in a number of countries overseas. So they are shifting. Do you think they will interfere less in 10 years or 20 years as they become more powerful? I think they will increase their interference. And I also think that it's not going to be a bipolar system with East-West capitalist communist, but that China will invest money, diplomatic ties, military ties, export their surveillance technology to a number of other authoritarian regimes around the world. So basically, you're moving in a direction where we have a new US president saying the United States is the leader of the free democratic nations of the world and pointing to China as the leader of the authoritarian bloc. It's not going to be as similar to the Cold War, but I think this kind of new bipolar system might push us in that direction.
Elvenes and then Barth Eide.
China is a superpower in different way. Today, China is a superpower in intelligence search and their different connection to get information from other countries and the rest of the world. There is a chance, there is a risk that the rest of the world, especially small state, could be too servile to China. A main question is, why is China so afraid of criticism? And why will China try to protect themselves in a so wide degree as they do? The defense tension of China is very, very strong. Currently, 9 destroyers is under construction for the China Navy. That is 50% more than the the number of destroyers in the UK. Why? Is this only for protecting their trade routes, or do they have a greater ambition? That's the main question. And the Admiral Brun Hansen said something very, very interesting. If we will see Chinese warships in Arctic depends on Russia's willingness to open for this. And if Russia opens for this, we will have a completely new situation. There's no problem that China is a great trade nation. That's good for China, it's good for the rest of the world, and it's good for Norway. And in many ways, it's no problem that China is a superpower military too. But the problem is if they use this military power in politics to search influence in rest of the world with their values and their regime. Then we will change the world and the liberal world as we know it. And that's what we have to be observed on. The military is a vehicle to promote political influence in many other worlds, is my hypothesis.
Barth Eide.
Yes, but because I think China's promotion of power is more on the soft power side. And I think one thing we easily overlook is that just like America in the 50s and the 60s had a very strong power of attraction, a lot of countries wanted to be little Americas and kind of were drawn into the American sphere, not by coercion, but by their own desire, not unlike the Roman Empire in its heyday, by the way. China is now quite attractive, seen from Africa, Latin America, and other Asian countries. It provides system stability. It provides more happy people with a more wealthy. It gives you money without sending you to democracy and gender awareness course before you get them, and they actually deliver. And actually, I've seen this out in the world. China doesn't look bad from many countries in the world who would happily join the China sphere before they right. So that's also part of China's projection of power. Plus, of course, hard power military indeed. Arctic. Let's not confuse the South China Sea with the Arctic. Everyone, including China, has actually formally, legally stated that they fully respect the Law of the Seas Convention and its application for the Arctic. They signed that when they joined as observers to the Arctic Council, and that was also their pre-held position. And more importantly, around the Arctic, we know the states. It's not a lot of small island states with weak governance. It's us. It's Canada and the US, and it's Russia and it's Denmark. That's it. To my knowledge, none of them have any particular interest in becoming sort of, providing massive harbors and so on from China. Very different from around the South China Sea. Let's not confuse the two. We have control. We have to watch it and be close. I think we have control over that. Third of 4 quick points. We will be allies with China in free trade. China is fundamentally pro-free trade. As partners in free trade, we should also tell them that with free trades come certain other principles like intellectual property rights and certain rules on state support and so on, which they violate. So without turning into Trump, there is a dialogue to be held there. And why are we leaving it only to Trump to say certain things which are right and then overdoing it and then killing the whole system on the way, as he tends to do when he walks into a room? There is a dialogue to be held if we want to be partners. And of course, we can't do it alone, so we have to do it with partners. Very last point. Most authoritarian systems fail because they don't understand what people think and how they live. Not true for China. If there's something they know exactly what everybody thinks all the time. There's a downside to that. But it also means a much more prepared authoritarian regime to adapt policies to be more in line with what people think. It's not exactly through referendums or elections, but it's simply because they know, and they're very good at knowing it, and that actually has calibrating effects on system survival.
Time is flying. So, we are supposed to close the panel very soon. I would like to challenge the panel on one last question before we close the panel and have the response from each one of you. And my question is, up to now we have been discussing more the sort of direct challenges China presents to us. But at the conference there has also been a lot of talk about the more indirect challenge, being that because of China's rise, the United States would have to give priority to the Asian Pacific or Indo-Pacific theater, meaning it would have probably to downsize its presence in Europe. How do we deal with that? Is the solution to try to keep the Americans engaged in Europe, or is the answer to develop the defense budgets in the European countries and have more coordination between the European countries? If Barthe can start, Elvenes, Tybring-Gjedde, and then the professor.
We need, as a transatlantic power, we need to do everything we can to maintain close relations to the US, both bilaterally and in NATO. But we need to also support Euro-NATO, or the European dimension. We need to take more responsibility because the Americans won't. And the Americans have to be some kind of backup or guarantor of last resort. But most of the work has to be done by Europeans, and then we have to organize better and smarter in order to get that. So that's that answer. I also very much agree with Professor Ross yesterday saying that we should show an interest in the East Asian theater. And we should, as by the way we did in our time in government, we'd occasionally send a few observers, maybe a ship once and then, just to show presence. Not to do anything very important, but the Americans like to have another flag, even if it's from a small country. But beyond that, our work is at home, because we have to do what the Americans will not be doing in the future.
Thank you. Elvenes and then Tybring-Gjedde.
We heard today that the only superpower which is not in Arctic today is China. When will China be in the Arctic is the big question. We know that the key driver for China in their global expansion is to secure resources. Their lack of resources will grow, and in 2030, 75% of oil and gas will be imported. So I think it's a question about time when we will see China more in our neighborhood. And in this situation, Norway has a very, very important role. We must not come in that situation that the superpowers stand face to face in our neighborhood with Norway in a more absent role. So our solution, our strategy in this question is to keep the transatlantic connection. It's very, very important. And we have heard and we understand that United States anticipate that Europe and Norway should take a greater responsibility for own security. The reason for that is that United States has no capacity, economic and military, to be here in such degree as they has been, and at the same time being in the South Asia, which the situation require. So the answer is yes. Norway's role as NATO in North is growing more and more important. We have to take this role, and we have to exceed our defense budget, and we have to strengthen the cooperation with not all of the NATO, but some of the main countries in NATO, which are the countries which are most similar to us. And that is Netherlands, UK, Germany, and France, more or less. Understand me in the right way. The problem, the problem now is that NATO is.
The rest of you can leave the room. And
we have to talk, take a talk after. But the problem now is that NATO is so big; it consists of 29 member states. And to have a common opinion what the main threat to NATO is difficult. I'm a member of the same NATO Parliamentarian Assembly as you, and in that meeting we observe that the states south in NATO consider the situation in Africa and the refugee pressure against Europe as a bigger threat than the Soviet Union, the Russian threat, and perhaps the Chinese presence in Arctic. So therefore, I said about France. France is here in the strategic middle. You are now intensifying their. Yeah. So that's the reason. Yeah.
Christian Tybring-Gjedde, please.
Just very short about this agreement with Norway and China. It's just my point is that this may be necessary, but there's no reciprocity. That was my point. That's why I read it. It could be a reciprocity here, and you can have a trade agreement. There's no problem. And I also think that because we are in a democracy, we have to be aware that there's a difference if Sanders should win the presidential election or Donald Trump should win re-election. And we have to be aware there is very different U.S. policy here. That's what the danger is about the democracy. It can be very different policies here. In China, it's the stability, so you know how it's going to be also tomorrow. I think you should be aware of that. And another thing that we also should be aware of. We're talking about Article 5, and of course our attack on Afghanistan after 9/11. It was of course obvious an attack on the United States. But we are also expanding the idea of Article 5, and we're making all kinds of reasons for that, and it could be good reasons. But we have to be aware of that. How would we think if China was doing the same thing and putting their forces different places in the world and saying this is because we need to protect our territory? I think we should be very much aware of what we are doing ourselves before we actually are so sure about what everybody else is doing. And so I'm a little skeptical about the NATO missions everywhere, and also the newest attempt to get support France in Sahel region, which I don't think Norway belongs there at all. And I think we should be very careful of what we do. And I think everything should be done, of course, under the NATO umbrella. But there also we should discuss what we actually are doing outside our NATO territory.
Thank you. Øystein, very brief.
Yeah, so read my article from 2013. I participated in this conference because the interesting thing was many of the issues we discussed in this conference was discussed, I think it was 2013 or 14, but this was just a few months before Russia went into Ukraine, and it was the backdrop for that was Hillary Clinton and Obama's pivot and rebalancing. And in NATO, many were thinking of what role should NATO play in East Asia, and I published an article. It was in this journal Survival, but it was basically an argument about division of labor. And I basically my conclusion is very much what Espen Barth Eide said here, that this is natural that the United States is shifting towards a rising China. And it means that the United States, now the European states, has to take more responsibilities for their own security and defense, both in Europe and in the broader Mediterranean region, in the Gulf, MENAs, and these areas. So I think that is kind of, I would still go with that argument.
Yeah.